This is another in the Project Bionics Pioneer Interview series. Project Bionics is a collaborative history project of the American Society for Artificial Internal Organs, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Library of Medicine. I'm Susan Speaker, a historian at the National Library of Medicine, and with me today is Judy Chelnick, curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and we are here today, August 25th, 2015, in Bethesda, Maryland, to do this interview with Mrs. Jean Kantrowitz. Welcome, Jean.
I'm delighted and privileged to be here.
We are privileged to have you here. You were married for 60 years to Dr. Adrian Kantrowitz and worked side by side with him as an administrative coordinator for many of his cardiac assist device projects and probably everything else, and as a co-founder of your company, LVAD, and we'd like to get your side of the story since Adrian was interviewed by Project Bionics back in 2005, I think. We wanted to start out by asking you about your early background, your schooling, your interests. You started out with a business degree and then got a master's in business education, and then you met Adrian, and everything changed. So could you tell us?
For sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about the early days and meeting Adrian, and we'll fire some more questions at you from there.
Do you want me to start with the early days of schooling? Or?
Please.
Yes. Well, I was born in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, 15 miles from New York City. People lived and died in Passaic, New Jersey, and never went to New York City. I was born in 1922, so by the time I was 7, the world changed. And I think it's a fair description to say that I was Depression, if not born, Depression brought up. Mm-hmm. And that had a profound effect on me. To work you go, to school you go, that's all there is to do. So I went to elementary school and high school in Clifton. There was absolutely no money. I had an older brother, 4 years older, and he had had violin lessons. And why can't I have violin lessons or piano lessons? Because there is no money, and that was the answer for everything.
Sure.
So at 14, I went to work on weekends as a sales girl, and wanted to go to college, but saw no way to go. I was the editor of the high school yearbook. This was Clifton High School. And the advisor for the yearbook was a Mrs. Lesser, and she was a teacher of typing. She got to know me very well, and she said, "You must go to college." And I said, no way. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Well, I was trained at Rider College. They train business, they have a business education program. You could be a teacher of business subjects. They have a journalism program, and they had a great basketball team." Claire B. was the basketball coach, and he was world-renowned. Okay. And she said they do offer a 4-year scholarship. It's competitive. You have to take an examination. Why don't you try for it? Mm-hmm. She was very proactive about it and arranged for me to stay with friends in Trenton so I wouldn't have to spend money on lodging and so on. I took the exam and won. There were 2 to the entire state. So I had a 4-year scholarship. The school did arrange for me to get room and board by washing dishes in a sorority, of which I subsequently became president while I was washing dishes. Wow. And I graduated from Rider College in Trenton. I did a practice teaching, that's what they called it, in Lodi, New Jersey. Lodi was a very rough place. I found that I had to walk with my back against the wall in the hallways.
Wow.
And after that, I decided that I didn't want to be a cop. And coincidentally, I got a letter inviting me to apply for a fellowship at the University of North Carolina, the Greensboro campus, where the Women's College was, which was an entity of the University of North Carolina. So I said to myself, well, you know, a little good money after bad, maybe I will like college teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I accepted the fellowship. And that was life-changing for me. I enjoyed the courses, and the program required a research project. None of this business of you can take a 3-point course or do a research project. It was a research project for 3 points. So I selected a research project and carried it out. And my advisor submitted it for a research contest, an honorary society, professional society. And the result was that the first prize went to a PhD from Harvard. I won second prize. And the third prize went to a PhD from Harvard.
All right.
Well, you know, I didn't really understand at the time the significance of that. It has grown on me. After that, the war was on. There were all kinds of opportunities. And among other things, I got a job. There were no men. There were no trained people. And there was a Jersey City quartermaster office, a huge building with many thousands of employees, and they needed somebody to train people who had no training at all, because that's the only way they could hire.
Excuse me, this was for the Army?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I sort of ran a little school within the quartermaster office.
Okay.
And that was fine. I enjoyed it. Then the war ended. And Winston Churchill went to Fulton, Missouri and made a speech.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I did not become the Prime Minister of England to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire.
Right.
And that was the beginning of the Cold War. So I was still working at this Jersey City quartermaster building, an office. And I lost interest in what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me realize one thing, that it wasn't nearly as much the work you do, that I would do, as the reason that I was doing it. I had to care about it. So that was a lesson for me.
Can you talk a little bit about the project that you developed when you were in North Carolina and how that influenced you?
Well, yes. The subject itself was really trivial, okay? In the teaching of business teachers of accounting and typing, which is what this program was, there was a lot of talk about standards. And in connection with typing, they would say, well, you must produce a letter with no more than 2 mistakes, or it will not be called a mailable letter. It will not be a mailable letter. Okay, so I began ruminating about that, and it sounded a little artificial to me. So I thought about finding out, well, what is really a mailable letter? This is so insignificant, truly. I'm embarrassed. But so what is a really mailable letter? How would I find that out? Well, I would find that out if I was able to look at a bunch of letters that had actually been mailed and received. Greensboro, North Carolina at that time was a big insurance center. I'm not sure that it still is. So I went to one of the insurance offices, and you know, everybody was always interested in the college and whatnot, and the students. And I explained that I was interested in looking at a batch of letters that had been mailed and received, and preferably from one source, so that there was, you know, it wasn't all over the place.
Right.
Sure, you know, opens up a drawer, gives me the 100, you know, come whenever you want, here's a desk for you, couldn't have been more cordial, and so on. And of course, the reality is that was ridiculous. Letters had many more mistakes than two, and so on. So it was a very trivial subject and a very trivial outcome, but perhaps an interesting approach. And maybe that's what caught the eye of the reviewers of the. And it also taught me a lot about research. You have to ask the right question
Yes.
to get the right answer.
Okay, so the war is over. The Cold War starts. You've decided that you don't really have the spirit to keep going at the quartermaster's office. And then what happened?
Well, I actually was attracted to research jobs and statistics and things like that. And I was engaged to prepare data for labor negotiations for a trade union.
Okay.
And I did that for a while and enjoyed it.
Okay, yeah, that's some interesting work, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, and then in 1948,
Well,
you met this guy.
it was the presidential election year.
Yes.
So there were rallies, and in New York City, the rallies were at Madison Square Garden. And I was going to one of these rallies, and I had a date with a friend to meet somewhere in front, and I was standing there. And this guy comes along that I recognized as having met several years earlier. He had come to a dance, we called them, with a friend from New Jersey. And I said to him, "Aren't you Adrian?" He said, "Yeah." And we chat for about a minute, milling crowds.
Okay.
And he said, "Well, you know, I have a car. Can I take you home after the rally, after whatever the program was?" I said, "Sure." So I met him, and he pulls up in this light green convertible Oldsmobile. Wow. You know, that made an impression. Right away, I get in the car, and then he quickly says to me, "Do you mind if we make a little detour? I want to stop at my parents' house." I said, "Sure." So he goes north. I had a small apartment on the Lower East Side. We goes north to 84th Street and West End Avenue. And those buildings had sort of 2 apartments to a floor, 8 or 9 rooms. They were very large apartments. And I go up and I meet his mother and his father, who turned out to be very interesting people. I mean, we weren't there that long, but his father was a general practitioner.
Right.
And his mother was a costume designer for the Ziegfeld Follies.
That's a job you don't hear about all the time.
Yeah. And so for a little diversion, she was a woman very much ahead of her time. She had 4 children. She was a very talented designer. She went to Paris twice a year for the fabrics and the shows. She would go with her Louis Vuitton trunks, and there was somebody for the children, and so on and so forth. His father, as I said, was a general practitioner, and I have a picture of his office in the Bronx. And his father has started a prepaid plan. He would take care of a family for 10 cents a week.
Okay. sort of a
Well, I didn't know all that, of course, on this first meeting. I think it was quite brief, and then he took me home, and that was that. And 6 months later, we were married.
Okay. Did you have any idea that you would be ending up working in the field of medicine or
None
with medical
whatsoever.
devices?
None. But let's linger on that first time, because much later I realized that Adrian had made a decision immediately, or he would never have taken me to his parents' home, and that it was a surgical decision. He was a surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
A life-changing decision.
It was,
Indeed.
I think, for both of us.
And did he talk to you about his work that first time
Very
out?
early, oh yeah. He was talking about, the heart's a pump. We can make pumps.
And
He was very mechanical. He had an older brother who was also gifted mechanically and became a physicist with very original contributions in aerospace and so on. I think it can be safely said that he solved the reentry problem.
mm-hmm.
That's Arthur Kantrowitz.
Right.
And they were a pair. They were blind for 3 days once. Why? Because they were trying to make headlights that dimmed with an oncoming car. I don't think anybody has that now.
No.
And so they were temporarily blinded. Of course, the family was hysterical, but anyway. And they built an EKG out of radio parts and
Right.
stuff like that.
Right.
When Adrian told you about his idea of building a heart pump, what was your reaction?
I don't know that he... Well, of course, I was kind of dazzled by this guy, I have to tell you that. I just thought that's fine, Worthy cause.
Okay, you sort of became a working partner with your husband fairly early on. Can you tell us a little bit about how that relationship unfolded? I mean, you got married and started a family, and he had these research projects going on at the hospital.
So here's a little bit of what happened. Adrian was a resident when we were married. And because of World War II, and also because the surgical boards require a pyramidal program in
Right.
which you have to have a chief residency in surgery in order to qualify for the boards.
Right.
There was a queue. People had been away and they were all stacked up and coming back. And so he had 6 months of downtime. And he had been thinking about about surgery on the heart. And he thought there was talk of pump oxygenators,
Right.
but none available. But he thought a pump that would allow vision of the mitral valve, one side of the heart, that did not require an oxygenator,
Mm-hmm.
would be a thing he could do. And so he went to the chair of medicine. His name was Louis Leiter, very well known at the time, and asked what he thought about what Dr. Leiter thought of the idea. He thought the idea was worth pursuing, and I am going to give you a grant. It was $300, and see what you can do with it. This was at Montefiore Hospital in New York, where Adrian was a resident, and they housed only cats. The only research being done was being done by a neurosurgeon, a Dr. Leo Davidoff. And he used cats as an animal, as an animal model. And so that had to be it. And he did 70 cats in the 6 months. And the last one, he was able to show that he could have the animal maintained by the pump, and the animal survived, and so on.
You guys adopted that one, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
And its name was 60?
Well, it's the name. Yes.
Am I getting ahead
You have
of
a
the
good
story?
memory. Yes,
Sorry.
that's right. And that was a fascinating cat because obviously it had been given up for adoption or something like that, or been in somebody's home. Came in, found the bathroom, hopped on the toilet, and urinated. So we may have to cut that.
No, keep it in. It's a great story.
Anyway, so, and then I'll tell you another one which you haven't heard. So this cat had some kind of sores or something, and it had a bad odor. So I said, we need to find a veterinarian and get some care for this cat. So we drive down to Greenwich Village, and there's a storefront. Dr. Kolodny, K-O-L-O-D-N-Y was the name.
Okay.
And we go in and said, this cat's in kind of bad shape. It has these sores and so on, and it has a terrible odor. So Dr. Kolodny says, well, I take care of these sores. A little gentian violet will clean it right up. He said, but as far as the odor, this is an odor of a male in full bloom. And he said, the only way I can do this is to alter this animal and so on. And I said, sure. Adrian said, absolutely not. That was it. Anyway, that's the little story.
Okay, so as time went on, during this period, during the 1950s, the NIH is growing, and grant money is becoming a lot more readily available for projects just like Adrian's. And you got involved in a lot of the grant application writing and grant management, right?
Well, let me back up because I think you asked the earlier question about how all that started. Maimonides was in Borough Park in Brooklyn. It was really not an area where you could recruit anyone with any sophistication or and so on. So I had, I guess, an Underwood typewriter at home. And I, of course, knew how to add. I knew a debit from a credit.
Okay.
And so he wrote his own grants. And the first ones, if I can remember correctly, one was called Augmentation of Coronary Flow. One was called an experimental, you may know better than I, artificial ventricle or auxiliary ventricle,
Yes,
I think it was.
that was it.
And these were in the $9,000 range, something like that. The first one, I think the second one maybe was 2 years, 9 and 15 or something. And experimental construction of an auxiliary ventricle and augmentation of coronary flow. Those were the two first ones.
Right.
In reverse order. And they were funded. And he then, he had a clear vision of what he wanted to do. He wanted to assist the failing left ventricle. He wanted to do it with using muscle somehow so that there'd be no artificial things in the body and so on. And So he had this idea of freeing the leaf of a the diaphragm, excuse me, and wrapping it around, first he wrapped it around the heart, and then he wrapped it, which was not very effective, and then he wrapped it around the aorta, and stimulated the heart when it was relaxed. So I think we have to go back a bit. Adrian had a number of people who were really very excited about the work that he had done in that 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that he wanted to do surgery, and there was no heart surgery at the time, and what his interest was. There was a Dr. Rifkin there who was an internist, and very supportive and very wise. And what he said to Adrian was that if he, I think I have a little out of order. He was so supportive that he invited Adrian to set up office in his office.
Ah, okay.
To make it very inexpensive for him on West 86th Street near Central Park West and so on. And so he told Adrian, he said, if you really want to do something in this area, you're a carpenter. You really have to learn cardiovascular physiology. And the best cardiovascular physiologist at the time was Carl Wiggers at Case Western Reserve. Right. It was just Western Reserve then.
Yeah.
And he had a USPHS grant for training fellows.
Right.
And the long and short of it was that Adrian filled out an application, and he had, I think it's actually started practice, but he was accepted by Dr. Wiggers, and we went to Cleveland in 1951.
Yes.
Nikki, my oldest child, was 6 months old at the time. And that was really life-changing for him. He had had this idea about kicking in with a booster during diastole when the heart is during the relaxed phase of the heart cycle. And he discussed that with Dr. Wiggers and the group there, who included Matt Levy, Bob Byrne, and a Bob Alexander. Byrne and Levy became editors, I believe, of Circulation or Circulation Research. Mm-hmm. And both were department chairs, I think, subsequently. And there was a Dr. Alexander there who became chair of, I think, cardiology or cardiovascular physiology in Albany. In any case, it was really a world-class group. And they were very tutorial for Adrian and very encouraging on this experiment, and he did the experiment. So he did some bench testing, and then he did animals, and that was published. I think he gave a surgical forum presentation first, and then it was published after that. Mm-hmm. And this would be in 51, 52, something like that. And then it was very much a preoccupation as how to turn this into a treatment for chronic heart failure. That was his goal from day one, heart failure.
So, as you said, this is a life-changing experience for Adrian, but was it a life-changing experience for you as well?
Well, it was an interesting time. You know, I had fallen into the education that I got. But all along, you know, I really wanted to be a lawyer. So here I was with this 6-month baby, and I sashayed over to the law school. And I met the dean of the law school, I guess he was the dean of the law school, Potter Stewart, who later went to the Supreme Court. and talked with him, and he says, why don't you take a couple of courses? And I took contracts and torts. Really important. And but I was very frustrated because I had to go home to the baby. We had no money for more sitting, and I didn't want to be apart from her that much.
Yeah.
And I said, I actually did quite well, notwithstanding that I couldn't spend as much time in the library as I would have liked at that time. You know, there was obviously no television or web or anything like that. And I decided I had to do this when my kids were out of school. And, but it really never left me.
And how did you parlay that into becoming the managing partner with Dr. Kantrowitz?
Before we leave Cleveland, I should tell you a little more. Okay. So not being able to sit still, I guess you figured that out by now. I got a part-time job that I could partly do from home. And it was with Frances Payne Bolton, who was the Republican representative from Cleveland. And she was being redistricted. And she needed someone to make an analysis for her on her new district, what all the ethnic groups were. And there were many.
Yes.
In
Yes,
Cleveland.
there were.
Yes, there were.
There
there
absolutely
still
were
are.
many. And so I could do quite a bit of that from home with old newspapers and stuff like that. I did have to go to the library and so on. But I got to know Cleveland very well in that process. And I enjoyed that very much. And it was a form of research also. So that was the Cleveland year.
Did you live close to campus?
I'm sorry?
Did you live close to campus?
No, not exactly. We found a tiny little house, 2 bedrooms, and it was the last house in Shaker Heights on Scottsdale Boulevard.
I know where that is.
You know where that is.
Right before on the Cleveland line.
Yeah.
Right.
So that experience at Western Reserve, how did that prepare you for managing Adrian's laboratories?
Oh, I didn't manage the lab. I did not manage the lab. There was always, there were directors. When Adrian got the money in grants, he was enabled to get a full-time director of experimental surgery. It's very hard to do clinical surgery and spend a lot of time in an experimental surgery lab or an engineering laboratory. Either one, doesn't matter. You're always called away. So actually that's what started his looking at grants and larger grants, because he knew the only way that he could do both, and he very much wanted to stay in clinical surgery, was to have the money to support a staff of full-time people who were there all the time.
Okay. So you did manage the lab, but you managed what part of...
I managed the administrative aspects. People who ran the lab were Dr. Akutsu and subsequently Dr. Dov Jaron, bioengineer. Both were absolutely wonderful and had interests of their own, which they pursued, and so on. So I was the paperwork person, you know, the gopher. That's it.
You were telling us earlier, though, that you made sure that you were not just a volunteer, not just the doc's wife dropping in.
Well, yes, I had helped him from at home. The children were small, and the grants were small. And then he had really won a friend in Bob Ringler, who was the deputy director and
at
the what was then the National Heart Institute.
Okay.
Okay, so with these small first grants, he went down there and insisted that I come with him. And it turned out that Bob Ringler was the person who met with him. And they connected very quickly. Bob was a cardiovascular physiologist who had actually worked at Henry Ford. Always had, I think he was chewing a cigar a lot. And so he was a very good guide because Adrian's first thought was to have something that didn't require artificial materials and things going through the skin. You know, he foresaw all of that. He wanted something that could work with native tissue and so on. He did these diaphragm experiments that I've already mentioned, and so on. And then he got very excited about that because in very short-term experiments, he got results. When the aorta was squeezed during diastole, this helped and it worked in the animals and so on. And so he began thinking about this, and he said, well, you know, if we could do long-term neurostimulation, then we could help paraplegics who have bladder, who have, what is the word for? Neurogenic bladder. Neurogenic bladder. For, you know, all kinds of conditions. He discusses this with Dr. Ringler and suggests all the other possible applications for this. And Dr. Ringler said, well, what you need is a program project because you're going to be involved in all these different therapies, you need all these different specialists, you know, so on and so forth.
And this is a multi-year grant, right?
Now, so far he's got 9 and 15 or something like that. And Dr. Ringler said, why don't you just get a larger scale sort of multi-project grant, maybe $200,000-300,000, and then if you do well with that and you have good results, then you could apply for a program project, which is what you really need to pull this off. That's what he said.
And those are the grants that go for 3 to 5 years.
They go to 5 years.
And you can just keep working and
right.
not have to stop and write for more money. Okay.
And you can hire people when you have a long-term outlook and so on and so forth. Anyway, so that's what he did. And this was a grant on the stimulation for many different therapies, neurostimulation for many different therapies. Well, what he found out was that it was not so easy. You could do a lot of things acutely, you know, that you can't do long-term. And there was scar formation around the electrodes and so on. And so then no more neurostimulation. And he decided that was life's work. He got some help from a biophysicist at Rockefeller Institute, Alex Murrow. And he would come over with these little silky electrodes and flanges and whatnot. And Adrian bagged it, basically, and said, you know, that's too hard.
Okay.
And then he moved to an electromechanical system. And the first one was a U-shaped device, which he also discussed with Arthur, and they worked together on it. And Arthur, by then, was working originally when Adrian worked with him when he was at Case, Arthur was in the Graduate School of Aeronautics at Cornell. And actually, he had a mathematician who was very helpful. Right. Although he was as well. And Subsequently, Arthur was asked to form a group, and it was mostly his students and junior faculty at Cornell, I think, who joined him at the AFCO Everett Laboratory.
Right.
And that was to, he was specifically invited to solve the reentry problem, which he had boasted at a cocktail party that he could do in 6 months, and damned if he didn't do it in 6 months.
Ow.
So anyway, so they came up with this U-shaped device, no valves. They divided the ascending aorta and connected this U-shaped device, which had a diaphragm in it, with little grafts, and that worked in animals. And so Arthur's group scaled it up and built a refrigerator-sized drive unit, which one day I would like to prevail on the Smithsonian to take because I still have it in storage. Anyway, so that was where that was. And they did one patient who actually was an alcoholic and bled. And then they did another patient who was a woman with rather a small chest. She lived for 12 days. I think that was the number. If you turn the device on, she went out of heart failure. And if you turn, it was the U-shaped auxiliary ventricle. If you turned it off, she went back into heart failure. And you could do that over and over again. And the Heart Institute knew about this, of course, and actually sent Sheila Mitchell, who was a statistician and MD, PhD, I think, too, as well, may have been in statistics. But she was Dr. Theodore Cooper's right hand, his associate. And she saw that patient. And there was a very high excitement at the time.
Could we go back and talk about your responsibilities as administrator? I mean, once you had the grant money and you could hire these
it's
people.
do what you're told or do what you're asked to do and figure out how to get it done. Okay. So
you had to hire people in areas that you
well,
didn't
this was
know anything
after
about.
this was after Dr. Ringler took the initiative, actually, and you know, I later learned some of the timing of what was going on at NIH. I'm not the expert on that. We already have that in our group sitting here. But there was there were other things going on in the background at the time. Michael DeBakey was very interested in mechanical assist. He had the ear of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had the muscle to poke NIH and the means to somehow or other get the money to them to do stuff. I'm certainly not the expert on that. All I know is that kind of thing was going on. And there was also an advisory committee that was proactively studying what to do about heart failure. And I only learned much, much later that Dr. Ringler, I think, staffed, or certainly was a staff member who attended those meetings. And I learned that only several years ago when I was digging for papers.
Okay.
And so when there was money for a program project, and this work on the neurostimulation was promising. It showed feasibility of all kinds of things.
Yes.
For example, a paraplegic was programmed to stand up and sit down under computer control. And we have photographs and movies of that, and that probably was the first time the possibility of doing something for coordinated limb movements. IBM was interested in it at the time, and so on. Yeah. And I think there are lots of groups working on walking motion for paraplegics now and so on. So.
Well, tell us about how you went about finding a model maker.
Okay, so the program project goes in, not without a lot of Sturm und Drang, but it went in. Well, it was done in a very short time. Bob Ringler said, if I told you the time that he gave to Adrian to get this in, I can't believe it myself now. It was literally weeks. And Adrian came down and said to me, we've got to get a program project out. I said, a program project? I haven't done anything like that. He said, we'll talk to Eugene. Well, Eugene was the head of the Long Island Jewish Hospital. He had actually designed the Hadassah Hospital in Israel, and he was a consultant. He was in the consulting business, too. And Adrian calls him, tells him our problem. I got just the guy for you. Dane Long was his name. Dane Long calls me up, and he says, I'm told you need help. And I said, yeah, but let me tell you something. I said, I'm not sure about what consultants do, but I don't need somebody to tell me what to do. I need somebody to help me do it. He said, I'll be there tomorrow. Get all the stuff out, and I'll read what your background stuff is and so on. And he did help, and we did get it out in a very short time.
You talked about finding your prototype maker.
Oh, you want to hear about that?
Yes.
Okay. So then the money comes in, and we hired an engineer, and presently we got a student in from Brooklyn Poly. His name was Paul Freed, to do his master's thesis. And it quickly became clear that Paul Freed was really bright, really inventive, and Adrian wanted him to stay, which he did. And Paul figured out how to make balloons for a balloon pump. We can go back to how all that arose, but you want to hear about the prototype maker. So he was making balloon pumps, and presently it became clear that would be full-time and that we needed somebody to make balloon pumps and be a prototype maker for also the little bad things, I can call them now. So Adrian said, well, go get a prototype maker. And I said, okay. So tell me your dream person. He said, my dream person would be somebody who makes radio-controlled airplanes from scratch. I said, okay. Can't put an ad in the New York Times for a radio control model maker. That's not where they look. And I thought to myself, well, they must buy supplies somewhere. So I go to the hobby shops that have the supplies for the model makers. And I make a nice leaflet, and I ask the owner of the shop, can I leave these here? I went to 3 or 4 in Brooklyn. They all said, yeah, sure. And all these envelopes began coming in. And one of them was a long one, overstuffed. And I open it up, and out come these photographs of these exquisite model ships. Well, that wasn't an airplane, but I thought it was interesting. And I walk across the hall to Adrian, and I fan out these pictures, and he says, hire him. And that was Sidney Wolbeck. Paul Freed taught Sidney how to make balloon pumps, but Sidney was just absolutely wonderful with his hands. And in time, he eventually, while we're talking about him, when we moved to Detroit, he couldn't leave. His wife was tenured at Brooklyn College or something like that. And he went to work for Datascope and became the person who I believe invented the furled balloon, which enabled percutaneous access for balloon pumps. because first it was in the hands of a surgeon. They did a femoral artery cut down.
And didn't you do something similar when you moved to Detroit in looking for somebody, for
Yeah.
a model maker?
Yeah, by then we were into something that we called by a half a dozen names. There's a little schizophrenia there. We called it a dynamic aortic patch and so on and so forth. And we used there was a textured flocked material that was soft, and it required putting on a sewing rim and sewing. So I went to the only really fine fabric store in Detroit called Haberman's and asked if I could leave a leaflet there for a seamstress. And we found another prototype maker for the different kind of prototypes that we had at that time.
Do you remember her name? Do you remember her name?
Oh, sure, yeah. Actually, there were several of them.
Oh, okay. Could you talk about learning to negotiate the NIH grant maze? And
Well, I was sort of very simple-minded. I knew bookkeeping. And what I knew about encumbrances. And the hospital was on a cash basis. And there was a huge problem. You never knew how much money you had because they were way behind on the bills. By the time the bill came in, the bill got paid. But here in the meantime, you've ordered stuff and you're obligated for that. You've obligated the funds, you've encumbered them, and so on. So I set up my own encumbrance system and ignored the hospital's record keeping for money. That was probably the first and most important substantive thing that I did, that we knew how much money we had at any given moment. Okay, I didn't rely on anybody down in the accounting office.
Very smart.
And so then things also happened because I did understand accounting, in which I was really concerned about some handling of funds and so on, and I went down and met Rosalie Silverberg in person to discuss it.
At NIH.
At NIH. I didn't want to do it on the phone. I didn't want to write letters. Just to see whether I was off base or on base and so on. And it happened that the particular problem that I brought to her was not something that could be solved. But I think it was the beginning of my personal separate relationship with folks in the administrative of grants management and so on.
Okay.
And
Rosalie was actually in the program. She was a scientist. She was in the program project, but I guess work gets around.
And that evolved into your becoming,
Well-
I don't know what you call it. You started going on site visits.
Right. They called me. This was after 1970. We were already in Detroit. And there had been an extensive relationship with the NIH and the moving of a program project. Adrian, well, we're not discussing that here, but there came a point at Maimonides in Brooklyn where it was clear that he had to leave. And there was a lot of questioning on the part of his members of the staff about the results in the balloon pump and one thing and another. And they actually stopped the study, and there's a little article that I wrote about that, as the details of which we don't have to go into now. But in any case, it was clear he had to leave there. And at that time, NIH had a policy that program projects could not be moved. The institution, at the time the funding was granted or the grant was awarded, or even possibly at the time of submission, I'm not sure, had to agree that if the principal investigator left, the program project would continue, and the institution would name another principal investigator. Of course, had to be satisfactory, I'm sure, to NIH and so on. So the question was, here he needs to leave this hospital, and what happens to this $3 million program project? That was a lot of money at that time, of which only part had been expended and part was left. And he had built a very beautiful study unit to study one patient at a time in that hospital. And it had a very auspicious opening. Dr. Cooper came and gave a beautiful address, and it was a wonderful reception and so on. And within 6 months of that unit opening, it was clear that he could not remain there. So this was very tumultuous on many fronts. And it was very tumultuous to the young people who had come to work for him as residents. They were drawn to the papers that he had written and so on, and interested in his work and wanted to be associated with him. And so that was a turbulent time, and a game changer, really, to leave Brooklyn. And his residents said they would not stay behind. They were going to go wherever he would go. I don't know how they came to that idea, but that he was going to find some place that would hire 8 residents. And amazingly enough, he did. But it was to the credit of Dr. Dennis, who was chair downstate, and who was his stalwart supporter and just a person of huge integrity, who later became head of the artificial heart program for a time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jean, before we took a break, we were talking about the move to Detroit, but before we talk any more about that, we wanted to ask you a little bit about how you recruited the research fellows for these projects, because there were a number of them over the years, and you mentioned that a number of them had come from other countries.
Yes, well, that was the marching order. You know, we have to identify research associates so they can work full-time in the lab and so on. So really it was, I did a literature search and looked at places that seemed to be interested in artificial organs or things of that kind. And then Adrian wrote a letter to the chair of the department, and nominations came in very quickly. There was very little research in Japan in medical devices at that time. There was a group in Hokkaido, for example, and that was where Yuki Noze, who went on to become an independent researcher and laboratory leader on his own, came from. There were many research associates from Japan. There's a little group there now.
Yes. Yes.
That when we were in Japan or made trips to Japan, would always arrange for a dinner, and they would always come.
Yes, we have pictures of
But
them.
Dr. de Villiers came from South Africa, and I believe he is a department chair. We had research associates, many from Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, France, Germany, and so on. Czechoslovakia, Spain, Italy.
Did they outnumber the American fellows?
Oh yes, we almost had none. There was Dr. Bill Yar, who spent a year. He was exceptional in many ways, including the fact that he was a U.S. resident.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And one of the other questions on our list was your memory of the biggest accomplishments, and
I'm sorry?
we wondered about your memories of the biggest accomplishments that you had during these years.
Oh, vivid accomplishments. Well, I can't claim credit for really anything related to the research, Adrian's research program. Perhaps independently, I had later after the period we're talking about, was invited to become a site visitor for administrative and fiscal affairs on large programs, on program project applications and so on.
For NIH grants?
For NIH grants, mainly Heart Institute, became National Heart, Lung and Blood eventually, and so on. And I did that perhaps 2 or 3 times a year for maybe over a 25-year period.
Wow.
I think there were 45 in all. But there were some very serious questions that were policy questions that arose, much broader than the particular grant and so on. I remember one was at Stanford. It was on the transplant program, which was actually thriving at the time. And recipients were living 4 and 5 years and so on. It was a very large grant, and most of the money was going to hospitalization because this was this continuing clinical trial. And perhaps less than 10% of an 8-digit grant was going just for the research itself. And the review committee was they were very conflicted because everybody wanted this program to go on. It was outstanding. It was the only one really in the world.
Excuse me, was this maybe in the mid to late 1980s?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I fast forward.
Okay.
So there was a lot of rumination about how to keep the program going, but not to pay for, not for the NIH to have to pay so much for hospitalization. And so a proposal that was made on the administrative side was to say that, okay, these patients are really doing well, going 4 or 5 years at the time. It's time for this to be reimbursed and recognized as a clinical therapy. And if that were the case, then this grant budget would be relieved of this $11 or $12 million.
And private insurance would?
And private or CMS or somebody would be paying for it.
Okay.
And so in that proposal, the proposal included saying, let's give them the first year of funding. And that will give time for negotiation. And they accomplished that, and that established reimbursement for heart transplant, which was a game changer.
Oh, yes.
At the time, Stanford was the only place, and everybody was referring their patients, and then many hospitals began programs after that. Right.
Very, very important transition in that whole saga of heart transplant.
Right. And I do think that site visit was the trigger for it.
Yeah. Good.
On to another question. If you had to write a job description for your work, what would it look like?
That's a great question. Well, think about it.
Okay.
And I'm not talking about myself, because this is a whole era of great innovation. I think that if you're dealing with innovation, the administrative support has to be innovative as well.
Yes.
Because if the job descriptions were already written, and if everything was already there, you really are not in an innovative place.
Okay. But could you still describe your job or your work?
Well, you have to do what the program requires, okay?
Is it fair to say that not every day was the same?
Oh, that's for sure. Every day was a surprise. And it was never, never dull. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of very great and happy times, but let me tell you, there are plenty of disappointments and discouragements and problems, and you have to work them out. We were perhaps talking earlier about a problem of what was going on with the surface of a prototype. There had never been any clotting, and all of a sudden there was clotting, okay? It took months to figure this out. And what did we finally decide? That the new factor was the change of the research associate. That the earlier one, who had been there for years, was Asian, did not perspire, and the new one was Caucasian, and his hands did perspire. The solution was, of course, completely simple. You just wear gloves. But it took a very long time to figure that one out.
But that had made the
that was
difference
the solution.
in the handling of the materials.
The handling of the materials, right.
Wow.
That's really very interesting.
Just these very small things that can just
There are a lot of small things.
really...
So you mentioned disappointments. What was the biggest disappointment?
I have to think about that. There were a lot of disappointments.
Sure.
I think we had very substantial, this is much later.
Mm-hmm.
We had a clinical trial and of a VAD, actually, and there were some issues with it, but also great promise. And we had a wonderful private sector investor, and because of internal family affairs and so on, and on that side of it, what that triggered a cutoff of really the money that it takes to do a clinical trial, which is a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say more than that. It all has to do with money, though. That there was a very good third round program project application. And in retrospect, the site reviewers would have been rejected, a couple of them, because of their own conflicting interests, if that review took place at this time or much later. But we were very naive about that. And there were two people on that site review who had very strong, who were totally involved with other kinds of ventricular assist devices. And I really believe that was a factor in the rejection of that program project. Why is that so important? Because I think huge effort was spent after that, always on just finding money to work, instead of the work itself. So that, I think, was a game changer.
Okay.
Why don't we move on to a somewhat lighter question. All three of your kids became physicians.
Yes.
And we wanted to get you on the record about how much you thought that they were influenced by knowing about the work that you and Adrian were doing, and we also wanted to ask, you know, how much you guys encouraged them to pursue these careers.
They would have to speak for themselves, okay?
That's a diplomatic answer.
One thing I have to tell you that I do regret, and that is that Alan, who became a neurosurgeon, I think would have liked to be a cardiac surgeon. And I discouraged that. I said, those are big shoes, Alan. You know, you need to cut out a swath of your own. And so he looked at a couple of fields where there hadn't been very much progress. I remember he looked at the time at orthopedics and neurosurgery and so on. And he went into neurosurgery. I think that, I said, you know, people are going to say, you know, it's nepotism and this and that. Well, people don't say that. They don't say that about John Kirkland. And so on. And, you know, when somebody shows they have the talents and the smarts and all that, I think that was a bad move on my part.
So you did talk about medicine at home a lot, and
our kids were really totally involved.
Okay, and they
there was a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I wanted to ask a question about whether or not they visited the lab.
Oh yes. Alan made rounds with his father, and
oh wow,
you know, girls did as well. So.
Is this something you discussed at the dinner table?
I can't answer that really.
No.
We discussed a lot of stuff. We had a lot of interests. There were a lot of interests in the family. Adrian was a pilot, he was a sailor.
That's right.
And the kids all had interests.
Must have been some good meals there at the Kantrowitz house. I would have liked to sit in on some of those.
Well, I have to tell you something. I don't cook very much now, but I did cook a very good brisket.
Of course you did.
and I don't know, some years ago, Lisa asked me for the recipe. I came upon it. I came upon a copy of it recently, and it started as follows. Executive summary.
That's too funny.
That's great. Yeah.
Okay, so we're wondering what your impressions of Asaya was in the early days and how that's changed.
What my impressions?
Asaya.
Oh, ASAIO. Oh, that was so exciting. That was so exciting.
Can you talk about the first time you went with Adrian to a meeting?
Yes. Well, it wasn't. Dr. Kolf invited him to an organization meeting in Atlantic City. I guess it was, there must have been associated with some other meeting. And I remember that it was at the Knife and Fork Inn, and I sat in the car for hours waiting for Adrian. Many years later, Karen Burke, the wonderful longtime executive secretary, director, I guess, of the ASAIO, had occasion to send me very early minutes of meetings, including the organizing ones. And it suddenly struck me that there had been easily 3 or 4 meetings before the one that Adrian went to, and that Dr. Kolf may have given everybody the impression that they were really at the very first organizing meeting. It charmed me because it was typically Willem Kolf, Pim Kolf.
Yeah.
So,
but that's incidental. The society was really a very exhilarating, very exciting, wonderful experience to go to the meetings because everybody was so engaged, so enthusiastic, so willing to help.
Yeah.
People would jump up with, well, why don't you do this? Or have you thought about that? And all of that. There was a vigor and an energy. And these days, of course, I think that environment is a victim of its own success, you might say, because everybody is very close-mouthed. Problems aren't, I'm sure, as deeply discussed as they are in-house in various houses, figuratively, and so on. It's a different environment. It's great, and I would say, you know, you asked me about my disappointments. I want to tell you about my pleasure. Certainly one of the great ones is to have been at a meeting, I think it was in maybe 62 or 3, National Academy of Sciences, where Dr. Gibbon, bounded in, shaven head, looking like a Greek god, John Gibbon, to talk about his pump oxygenator. And he showed a slide. I would say the pump oxygenator was twice the size of this room. It was gleaming. It was gorgeous. It was built for him by IBM, and so on. And also at that meeting, he was quickly followed by a man named Frank Golan. Frank Golan was at Antioch and was, I think, a refugee. And he had built an oxygenator. Now, the oxygenator was the tough part. And he told how he went to the local soda factory and got a little cartridge. And then he went to Woolworths and he got a hair clip. And altogether, these things cost like $2.48. And he made an oxygenator. But I illustrate that just as to have really been in a third balcony for all the things that have happened within one lifetime. That is amazing. And a huge satisfaction.
As it should be. It was just an amazing
Well, other
era.
people share it.
Sure.
But but I really think it's quite astonishing, you know, not to have gone over to see something go from concept to bedside, called translational medicine these days.
I'm going to ask you another question, which we did discuss earlier. Whose work, aside from Adrian's, did you find the most interesting?
In what period?
It doesn't matter.
Oh. I don't know. John Watson, I forget the name of the wonderful woman that he brought in who was making organs.
Doris Taylor. Doris Taylor.
Right, Doris Taylor. I thought that what she was doing was just fantastic.
Making organs?
Making organs?
Yes. I can't even be the one to explain it to you. John can, or he can coach me, and then we can turn that man off. She was growing organs. I
Oh,
thought that-
tissue culture?
in tissue culture, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so that's
Well,
much more recent.
It's more than just petri dish. It's the whole organ.
Oh, wow.
Okay, let's stay on point.
Okay, let's stay on
Sorry.
point.
Yeah, it's not my department, you know, so I can't use the right buzzwords for it.
Okay. Well, we only really had one more question.
Right.
And that was the question about Project Bionics and how that all came together. And you were talking earlier about hearing a speech, a wonderful speech that somebody gave and nobody recorded it, and
Pierre Galletti, who was
Yes.
a pioneer in pump oxygenators,
yes.
gave a wonderful speech. I can't, well, it had to be, you know, almost 20 years ago, I would say, at an ASAIO meeting. And afterwards, whether it was the president or I asked one of the top officers whether there was a copy of it, whether it had been taped, whether it had been photographed or anything like that. No, no, no. And shortly after, I think it was months, Pierre's wife had gone abroad, and the president of Brown University invited him to dinner. And he opened a door, thinking it was the door to the outside. It was the door to the cellar. He fell down the stairs, broke his neck, and died.
Wow.
And that made a profound impression on me. And I kept thinking, you know, well, I didn't need that, but to tell me that anybody can expire at any time. But it was very dramatic for me.
Yeah.
That was a huge loss, genuinely. And so I began talking about this, I guess, mostly with Karen Burke and maybe John. And the board initially said, you know, okay, no committee, no, we don't need another committee. We're gonna just have a work group and see what happens. And they said, let Jean chair it. And I said, I thought that would be a big mistake, that we needed a pioneer to chair it. And somebody came up with the idea, Bob Bartlett, who was absolutely wonderful. And
You said you didn't know Bob at the time, or you didn't know him very well.
I didn't know him very well, no. And John and Bob and I were talking and so on. I don't remember whether I talked with John Watson before that or not, or after that. I don't remember. But that's what made an impression on me. I was very aware that this was, to me, a very unusual group of people who thought out of the box.
Yes.
And that this was going to have a profound impact on medical care and so on. And that it needed to be captured for future generations. That was my thought.
Mm-hmm.
So they would get a feel for the personalities, the drive that it took.
Mm-hmm.
How did the MPH that you received in 1975 help with managing a medical device development company?
Well, first of all, I enrolled for an MPH because I wanted to legalize what I was doing. I didn't want to be Adrian's wife, okay? And the business education degree didn't satisfy that. So I sashayed over to the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan and told them what I was looking for. And they said, well, we have a program, a master's program for running a clinical laboratory. And I said, that's not what I do. And so I went away. And then I got a phone call, and the University of Michigan had just gotten a grant from the Office of Economic Opportunity to train people who had become, you remember, there was deinstitutionalization in the early 1970s, and they set up community centers, and they staffed them with local dentists, nurses, doctors, and whatnot. Turned out they didn't know anything about how to manage or how to run a program. You know, they were just good clinicians at what they were doing. So the OEM gave the University of Michigan and a California School of Public Health a grant to bring these people in for what today is very standard, an executive program. 4 days a month, Thursday through Sunday. You get all your classes. All your schoolwork is related to your job work, and so on and so forth. And so I got a call from the person who was getting this grant from the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he said, he described what the grant was and who the people would be, and they would all be adults, and they would be doctors and heads of Blue Cross and community this and nurses and whatnot. And he says, we don't have anybody in the group who knows anything about research. We'd love to have you.
Huh.
And he said the core work is going to be very, generic, like an MBA, like this. You're going to get statistics, you're going to get organizational behavior, you're going to get all kinds of things that you would get in another program. And I bought into it and went into the program. And I thought there was nothing they could teach me about hospitals and how wrong I was.
For instance?
Oh. I don't think I want to go into all the for instances, but the organizational behavior became my most favorite course because it explained all the things that had been happening to me in a theoretical way. It was a discipline and so on. So then a little time went by after I got the degree. Oh, by the way, there was a faculty review of this program to see, it was experimental for the university, to see if this executive program deserved a Michigan degree, that it was the equal of the full-time students at Michigan. So a professor by the name of Is Bernstein, who came into my life later on, into our lives later on again, he was an investigative dermatologist. And he chaired this committee. And he said to me, well, now you have your degree, what are you going to do next? And I said, Dr. Bernstein, I'm going to do what I was doing before, but I expect to do it better.
Great answer.
And he didn't think that was a good enough answer. They were interviewing, evaluating it for the university. Because, yeah, that's the truth. It turned out later on that Adrian decided he was a carpenter and needed somebody who understood the biology of skin to work with. And Is Bernstein turned out to be a collaborator. But I didn't go see him first. Anyway, that was the story.
You also talked earlier about, when we asked you the question about a woman working in the field of artificial organs in the 50s and 60s, and then the women's movement in the 60s and 70s, and how that may or may not have affected your professional life. And you gave a very interesting answer.
Well, I think I said I never felt any distinction because I was a woman. What I worried about most was that I was a wife. And I understood perfectly that people would perceive me as somebody who could not be objective, who could not be professional, who would just do whatever her husband told her to do, and so on and so forth. So I really had this identity crisis forever. So my attempt to get a legalizing degree, if you will, after that I said, well, I have to prove to myself that I have a bag of tools that can be used anywhere. And the lab was sort of going along. It was funded at the time or something like that. And so I was looking at ads, and I see this ad for a program developer for child psychiatry, an outstanding children's hospital in the Midwest. Well, being in Michigan, of course it's Ann Arbor. I answered the ad with my maiden name. And it comes back, Case Western Reserve. Rainbow Babies and Children's in Cleveland, right? And lo and behold, they asked me to come for an interview. So it turned out that the situation was that the Cleveland Foundation, which was a very early, if not the pioneer foundation to gather together a lot of family foundations, small foundations, and staff it professionally like the NIH. And they were proactive about what grants to make. And Cleveland had been burning.
Literally.
Yeah.
literally
Yeah.
burning. And so they proactively went to the University of, to Case Western Reserve, to the Department of Psychiatry, and said, you have been treating 12 children from Shaker Heights with analysis. This city is burning. There are emotionally disturbed children and their families not getting any help from this university. We want to fund a program for you. And the first thing they did was to bring in a child psychiatrist who had been very successful in Philadelphia in a ghetto.
Mhm.
And he started to work, and every year he went back and asked for more money. If only we had more money, we could do this. And finally they said to him, his name was Charlie Malone, wonderful man. All child psychiatrists and pediatricians are wonderful, I think. Anyway, Charlie, it's not money you need, it's management. Help. We will give you a $60,000 grant to hire someone to help you. And that was the ad. So I went on a lark. And he was interested in me. And the more I thought about it, and strangely enough, I live in Oakland County, which is about 30 miles north of Detroit, and there's an international airport there that supports all the big auto companies. They keep their jets there and whatnot. Pontiac Oakland Airport. There was an airline that was going from Pontiac Oakland to Burke Lakefront for $19.
Wow.
You haven't seen Berkeley yet.
So the bottom line was the pieces sort of came together because of that airline. And it was a half-hour flight. They gave you juice and coffee and a newspaper and a bagel.
Those were the days.
And you were there. And I kept a jalopy there. And all I had to do was drive up Euclid Avenue. And in the end, I took the job. I stayed there 2 nights. I went Monday and stayed Monday night and worked Tuesday. And I was back in the lab Wednesday. It was pretty much running on its own. And then I worked there Thursday and Friday. And Thursday nights was concert night.
Yes.
Yeah.
All I had to do was, they gave me rooms at Mather Dorm. I walked across the street, and there were always
Perfect.
patron tickets waiting to be handed out.
Yes.
And I had a wonderful time. And so I was there for 1 year, and then I sort of tapered off and helped for a second year a little bit. And they got a grant, and we developed a fantastic program. I thought it was. I knew nothing about this field, but this is interesting from a different point of view. When I started that job, they let me come to conferences, or they invited me to conferences on patients. The table in the conference room was easily twice this room's length. I would say it was like 30 feet long. And around the table, there was the child psychiatrist, there was the psychologist, there was the teacher, there was the phys ed person, there was a vocational person. There were at least 20 people of different disciplines talking about one child for 90 minutes.
Wow.
3 times a week. At that time, 75, there was a big hullabaloo about the cost of open heart surgery, that it was so expensive. And it took me about 15 minutes there, and I said to myself, you know, a person comes in for open heart surgery, so, you know, maybe they're there a week or 2 weeks getting worked up, and then maybe they're there 2 or 3 weeks after the surgery, if they have done well with the surgery, and they're finished. It's acute, it's expensive, but it's defined. This chronic illness, emotional disturbance, mental illness, this goes on forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yes, it does.
And I was calculating the earnings of the people, you know, the salary rates of the people for that hour and a half, 3 times a week per child. And it really impressed me about chronic illness and how seriously, what serious cost that is, socially, family, and everything else. So, I also learned something about myself there. Part of this whole thing was this identity thing
Right.
that I was trying to create. So having gone to the conferences, I recognized there were conferences for the general psychiatrists. They were the adult psychiatrists. And so at one point, I don't know, I was in the hallway and there was a handsome young man there that I recognized as one of the general psychiatrists. I introduced myself to him. And he said to me, "I know who you are. You're Charlie's girl."
No kidding.
No kidding. You're Charlie's girl. I was probably in my late 50s at the time.
How'd you feel about that?
Phew.
I never forgot it, clearly. On the other hand, before I could get this job, Charlie Malone brought me to the Cleveland Foundation and introduced me to the executive summary, the executive director, who was wondering what he was doing with this middle-aged lady. And we started to talk, and I told him about work with program projects, and NIH, and this and that and the other thing. Before that was over, in about 20 minutes, we were fast friends. We are fast friends to this day.
Okay.
He was a Brookings Institute guy, I think, and PhD. Now based, I think, in Annapolis.
Well, I think that wraps it up. We have learned a lot from everything you've told us, and we are very, very glad that you came to do the interview. It's been a privilege talking with you, and thanks so much for contributing your memoirs to Project Bionics.
Well, it's an honor to be asked to do that. And it's been a privilege, and the great privilege really has been all of the people that I've been associated with and come to know as friends at the Smithsonian and the National Library of Medicine, and of course at the ASAIO.
Thank you.
Thank you.